Good evening, everyone, and welcome warmly to the Royal Society of Edinburgh this evening, and particularly to those online. I believe we have over 50 people joining us online this evening. I'm the Chief Executive, Professor Sarah Skerritt, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. I have to do a little bit of housekeeping first. I think we're going to wait for the housekeeping slide to come up, perhaps. I'll ad-lib. Oh no, here it is, good. We're not expecting a fire this evening, although that might warm us up a bit, but I shouldn't wish for that. So if the fire alarm does go off, we need to evacuate. My colleagues will show you. We go out the way you came in, down the corridor here, turn right and assemble outside the dome where all names will be checked. Thank you very much. And I'd now like to give you a few words of welcome relevant to this evening. So I'm thrilled to welcome you all this evening to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. 2023 marks the tercentenary of Adam Smith, a celebration that has unfolded throughout the year and across the globe, with a special emphasis placed here in Scotland, of course. With key events orchestrated by institutions like the University of Glasgow and Panmure House, the tercentenary has been dedicated to reframing and contextualising Adam Smith and his work against a 21st century backdrop. A founding fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1783, a student, a scholar, and rector at the University of Glasgow. Smith is today considered the father of modern economics and is the most famous former student of the University of Glasgow. His pioneering work and thinking on political economy influenced individuals, organisations, and governments to think again about how a nation's wealth is built and developed, and how a society can prosper. Today, many would call Smith the father of capitalism and free market thinking, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh a beacon of the Scottish Enlightenment, hugely influenced by thinkers and iconic philosophers like Adam Smith. This year, and indeed this evening, the RSE wishes not only to commemorate his work, life, and impact, but to bring his world-changing ideas into conversations about the problems we face in society today. And we're delighted to welcome Professor Adam Dixon, the Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism at Panmure House, not to discuss what Adam Smith would think, but how. How might Adam Smith examine contemporary challenges like climate change and technological disruption? Indeed, the RSE's own strategic plan, launched in April this year, focuses on three key societal challenges to be addressed through contributions of RSE fellows and the Young Academy of Scotland members: climate change and environmental sustainability, economic prosperity and social cohesion and inclusion. And the RSE, being well connected across Scottish academia, government and civil society, uses its convening power to bring together key actors to address these pressing issues. As Scotland's National Academy, the RSE is a neutral place for discussion on issues that might be controversial and politicised. Discussions like this one, how should we be thinking about climate change and the rapid advancements of artificial intelligence? What frameworks, models, or perspectives might help inform how we address these challenges? So, thank you to you all in this room and online this evening for joining us to learn about and discuss Smith's ideas and their relevance to the 21st century. My thanks to Professor Adam Dixon and to Professor Martin Hendry for chairing this evening's discussion. And I will now hand over to Martin. Thank you.
Many thanks, Sarah, and good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome from me too. I know the room may not be particularly warm, but the welcome most assuredly is. My name is Martin Hendry, and I'm Professor of Gravitational Astrophysics and Cosmology at the University of Glasgow, where I'm also Vice Principal and Clerk of Senate. But tonight, I'm mainly here wearing my RSE hat. I'm Vice President for Public Engagement, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's event. So as Sarah said, the RSE is Scotland's National Academy. So just before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to first share a few thoughts of my own about the RSE's origin story and the place of Adam Smith within that. So the RSC was created in 1783 by Royal Charter for the advancement of learning and useful knowledge. And our contemporary mission remains the same, the deployment of knowledge for the public good. The origins of the RSC are closely linked to the Scottish Enlightenment, that remarkable 18th century period when Edinburgh's intellectual climate fostered great leaps forward in the arts, sciences, and social sciences, prompting the French philosopher Voltaire to observe that we look to Scotland for all our ideas of civilization. Now, in the late 1700s, the most prestigious of Edinburgh's many clubs and societies was the Edinburgh Philosophical Society. And in June 1783, it transformed itself into the Royal Society of Edinburgh, with all 179 members of the Edinburgh Philosophical Society automatically becoming founding members of the RSC. The first meeting of the new society took place in the old library of Edinburgh University on Monday, 23rd of June, and its founding members included the renowned economist and philosopher Adam Smith, as we heard from Sarah. So tonight's event will explore Adam Smith as a key figure of the Scottish Enlightenment, a prime example of the stellar cast of founding members that would establish the RSC as an intellectual powerhouse, with its fellowship going on to comprise many of the visionaries whose ideas would lay the foundation of the modern sciences and social sciences. And as Sarah has also reminded us, in 2023, the RSC has been marking the achievements and legacy of Adam Smith on the 300th anniversary of his birth. Smith is widely recognised as the most famous former student of the University of Glasgow. So that's two of us have said that, so it must be true. And indeed, it's a lot for me to say that as an astrophysicist, because our other very famous alumnus is Lord Kelvin. It's his bicentenary next year, but I would acknowledge, well, Adam Smith has had 100 more years to acquire global fame than even Lord Kelvin. So we'll give the accolade to Adam Smith this evening. But the RSC has been very proud to collaborate with Glasgow University on celebrating that tercentenary programme, and therefore tonight we're delighted that you can be with us for a real highlight of that programme. And who better to guide us this evening than Professor Adam Dixon, who holds the Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism at Panmure House, and who in a few moments will share with us his lecture entitled How to Think Like Adam Smith. So Panmure House, which was rescued and restored by Heriot Watt University and Edinburgh Business School, is the 17th century townhouse located in Edinburgh's Canongate, which is the only surviving residence of Adam Smith, who lived there between 1778 and 1790. It's situated close to the Scottish Parliament, in the heart of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the house is an important monument to Scotland's intellectual history. Turning now to Professor Dixon himself, he is responsible for developing and leading academic research at Panmure House. His programme focuses, among other things, on the role of the global finance industry, the role of the state, and the role of corporations. Trained as an economic geographer and political economist, Professor Dixon brings an interdisciplinary perspective to this work. He holds a DPhil in economic geography from the University of Oxford, a diplôme master de l'Institut d'études politiques de Paris, also known as Sciences Po, and a BA in international affairs and Spanish literature from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. So concerning the format of this evening's event, Professor Dixon will speak for about 35 minutes, and I would ask you to hold your questions during that time, but after his presentation, I will join Professor Dixon on stage to discuss and explore with him more deeply some contemporary themes related to the question, how to think like Adam Dixon. And at that point, Adam Smith, Freudian slip, but there you go. We'll be celebrating your tercentenary in a few hundred years. And at that point, there will be ample opportunity for audience Q&A. So we'll have roving microphones in the room here, and we will also invite questions from our audience online. So, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, without further ado, let me welcome to the stage, definitely Professor Adam Dixon this time, to share with us his lecture on how to think like Adam Smith.
Right. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to the RSC for inviting me here to speak on Adam Smith's, not his actual birthday, but in the 300th year of his birth. And thank you so much for you all for coming here on this dark, slightly cold evening. And those of you listening online, perhaps some of you listening online, it's warmer where you are. The heating, I have been told, isn't working, so that's why it feels a bit colder. But we're trying to recreate how it would be perhaps in the 17th or in the 18th century when Adam Smith was alive, and certainly it was much colder. So what would Adam Smith think about our world in 2023? As has already been said, as the father of economics, or as some conjecture, the father of capitalism, one would assume that Smith, if he were here with us this evening, would have much insight to offer about a range of topics. I wonder what Adam Smith would think about, for example, the rise of China or the state of democracy in the world today. Or what would he think of the influence of social media on our interpersonal relations? Why would we ask what Adam Smith thinks or what he thinks about a particular topic? Smith's works, and not simply his two great masterworks, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, are rich in insights from how markets and international trade work and the problems of public and private monopolies, to how we interact with our neighbors and how we perceive ourselves in public. In short, there's much to draw on from Smith in making sense of our world today. Like many great thinkers of the past, we are drawn to his works for answers, for guidance and wisdom, or as is often the case, to appeal to an authority to justify an opinion or some course of action. Indeed, Smith has been mobilized for a couple of centuries now as an icon of the free market and as an icon of limited government. Much has been written on this. For example, I would direct you to read Glory Liu's fine piece of reception history, Adam Smith's America, which chronicles Smith's influence on the American experience and the development of economic theory generally. While it is not hard to find passages in Smith's work to justify free market thinking, Smith's work isn't so easily pigeonholed into one corner of political and economic thought. But still in the liberal tradition. And just as there are elements of Smith that one could label as right or conservative or libertarian, there's plenty of Smith to inspire social democrats and the left. Indeed, there's another son of Kirkcaldy, the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who has found inspiration in Smith for his politics, reminding us that Smith was never some advocate for no-nonsense capitalism. And perhaps that's what explains the staying power of Smith. He can motivate diverse viewpoints, and from that, diverse and robust debate. And when I'm working at Panmure House, the home where he lived for the last 12 years of his life, as Martin said, just off the Canongate, especially when I'm there alone, I sometimes imagine a conversation with him. I've sat in was once his dining room where he hosted other luminaries of the Scottish Enlightenment, such as James Hutton, the father of geology, and Joseph Black, a chemist and physician, who was the first to identify carbon dioxide, a problem that we face in the 21st century. And I wonder what the conversation would be like. I picture a conversation perhaps with a glass of claret that Adam Smith would have drank at the time, and that is a nice red Bordeaux, with a thoughtful, but most importantly, careful thinker. After some pleasantries where Smith comments on how nice the restoration is, at least after I explained that after he died, the building fell into disrepair and at one point became a tannery, I imagine that we discuss what has happened in the 233 years since his passing. It's certainly too much to cover in one evening. What would leave him in wonder? What would surprise him? What would he admire? I'd like to think that Smith would be fascinated, just as he and his contemporaries were fascinated with how history plays out, how societies develop and change, how ideas emerge and take hold, how empires grow and collapse, or how we understand the cosmos and the natural world, how the human body works, what afflicts the human condition, and what constitutes art, music, and literature. Would Smith be disappointed about where we've come? Or would Smith be pleased? Some, perhaps many, have taken Smith as being prescriptive, There are some that hold there is a Smith model of political economy and, by extension, society, one that could be contrasted with models ascribed to Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes. Smith's model is, in short, leave markets alone and they will provide. Marx's model is let the proletariat decide. Keynes's model is have the state tweak the market to optimize its efficiency. I must admit that I'm still looking for this so-called model in Smith's work. Perhaps I've not read his work closely enough. And yes, I'm aware of Smith's reference to a system of natural liberty, but I don't believe we can take that as a model derived from any real-world experience, let alone treat it as a fully fleshed-out blueprint to follow. I struggled generally with finding much of anything that is prescriptive in Smith. To be sure, Smith was intrigued by the beneficial possibilities of markets and the possibilities of further specialization and unleashing innovation, abundance, and individual liberty. Moreover, we know that Smith was highly critical of mercantilism and the concentration of power by public as well as private entities. But there is nothing like a manifesto to be found outlining what should happen, let alone what will happen. This doesn't mean that Smith is devoid of normative judgments or critical policy recommendations. Indeed, Smith found slavery, for example, abhorrent. In short, I don't believe my conversation with Smith would be a discussion about whether or not we have followed his advice or not. We know that Smith painstakingly wrote and rewrote his works until his passing. Indeed, while living at Panmure House, Smith added an additional third to the theory of moral sentiments, while also revising The Wealth of Nations and drafting new works that went unfinished. Such diligence over time may suggest that Smith was working towards some perfect model of society, economy, and human relations. I'm doubtful of this. For me, Smith is better seen, just like his contemporaries of the Scottish Enlightenment, as focused on understanding how society has evolved, not how societies necessarily should or will evolve. Progress was not taken as inevitable. But this does not mean that Smith was devoid of imagining more ideal social, economic, and political conditions. In my conversation with Smith, I don't expect I would get very far with questions of the type, Professor Smith, what would you think? Considering how diligent he was in writing and then rewriting his works over decades, I imagine his response would simply be, Adam, and yes, we fortunately share a name, I will have to get back to you. Indeed, Smith wrote in a period that was pre-capitalist, pre-industrial, and pre-democratic. Our world is profoundly different from his. Who was able to vote in 18th century Britain, let alone anywhere else in the world? The answer is strikingly few. In 18th century Britain, general elections were decided primarily by property owners, the number of which was in the thousands, not the millions, who can vote today. To be sure, ideas underpinning mass democracy were certainly brewing in Smith's time, which drove debates on reform in Britain and revolutionary fervor in places like America and France. But modern mass democracy, as we know it, did not emerge until well after Smith's death. And extending the franchise to include women didn't come until the 20th century. We should also take care in referring to Smith as the father of capitalism. After all, the term capitalism didn't emerge until the middle of the 19th century. The first use of the term capitalism is typically attributed to the French socialist politician, historian, and journalist Louis Blanc in his book, The Organization of Labor, or L'Organisation du Travail in French. Capitalism for Blanc was the appropriation of capital by some at the exclusion of others. The question is what capitalism is, and was it present or at least more fully formed during Smith's time? And this issue is not simply reducible to semantics. Now, I think the easiest way to define capitalism is to look at the works of those most critical of that. And that would, of course, be Karl Marx and Marxist scholarship generally. Indeed, too few appreciate that capitalism as a concept is primarily of a Marxian vintage. And if you're wondering, appreciating this or engaging with Marxian scholarship doesn't necessarily make you a Marxist. You just have to take the hit of being accused of being a bourgeois reformist. Now, it is important, though, in that to entertain multiple approaches and interpretations of economic and political life. And to do so, I believe it is part of a healthy liberal tradition of scholarship and critical inquiry. Now, too often, capitalism is conflated or offered simply as market exchange and commerce. But this is too simplistic. Market exchange, wages, profits, and other characteristics of what we take as commerce and trade are not exclusive to capitalism. But what is capitalism? To take Marx's definition, it is where capital subsumes labor in production. That is, the capitalist directs the labor process. Moreover, the economic system is capitalist when that system of social relations predominates. By contrast, things like markets, profits, and even wages existed in antiquity and under feudalism. Yet the mode of production in these times was different, dominated by different forms, such as slave labor or other types of servitude and peasant subsistence farming. During Smith's time, merchant capital increasingly replaced the dominant form of production as the bonds of feudalism were broken down, at least in Britain and parts of Europe. Smith observed the emerging productive explosion that specialization generated as craft production was brought into factories, or at least more sophisticated workshops. And this is perhaps why Smith is often seen as the father of capitalism. But can we say that 18th century Britain was capitalist? There were certainly emerging elements thereof. The point, though, of what we think of as capitalism today was still in emergence. Moreover, there was no such thing as a capitalist world system. International trade existed, but this wasn't necessarily trade among capitalist economies. There was nothing like the complex global production networks that we have today. We also must remember that the Industrial Revolution was only in its very, very early stages. In 1776, three important things happened. That was the year that The Wealth of Nations was published. The Americans had the audacity to declare independence. And when James Watts's steam engines were first installed in a commercial setting. And I should mention also that, like Smith, Watt was also a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Now, if you take Marx's formulation, the rise and consolidation of capitalism happened through its paradigmatic industrial form only in the 19th century. But already in the 18th century, Smith was concerned about how the monotony of the emerging factory system and how further refinement of specialization would affect workers, their well-being, and the human condition generally. For all we know, had Smith lived through the first half of the 19th century, perhaps he too would be just as perturbed, shocked even at the working conditions in Britain's industrial cities. Maybe he too would call for revolution. Now, my aim here isn't to be disinvited from speaking to a group of more libertarian-minded individuals by referring to Smith in the same space as Karl Marx and insinuating that Smith may have become a Marxist. That is not my intent. My point, if somewhat provocative, is simply to emphasize that Smith's world was very different from ours, just as it was in comparison to the world that motivated the likes of Karl Marx decades after his death. Hence, I want to propose that rather than asking what Smith would think, a question I often hear at Panmure House, we should be asking how would Adam Smith think? The former is impossible, the latter is possible. And that, I would argue, also is fundamental to the liberal tradition of critical and open inquiry. Trying to determine what a long-dead thinker would say today, I fear, creates too much space for dogma by appealing to authority while robbing us of our own agency to think for ourselves. How, then, can we think like Adam Smith? To be sure, such an exercise is still subject to historiographical misinterpretation. In short, I don't hold my interpretation to be sacrosanct nor exhaustive. I am a mere interloper in the extensive and rich body of scholarship devoted to interpreting Smith's work and generally that of the Scottish Enlightenment, where disagreements and varied interpretations abound. But diversity of thought and disagreement is to be expected and is in fact what is beautiful and worth defending in an open and liberal society. Now, given my lecture this evening is being chaired graciously by an astrophysicist, And yes, I hope there will be time for me to ask Martin what he thinks of the statistical probability there is for extraterrestrial life given the size of the universe, a question you should ask all astrophysicists. I will frame my argument using one of Smith's lesser-known works. Sometime in 1750, in the 1750s, Smith drafted an essay which was published after his death entitled "The Principles Which Lead and Direct Philosophical Inquiries," as illustrated by the history of astronomy. Now, why the so-called father of economics was writing about astronomy may come as a surprise. But like many of his contemporaries during the Scottish Enlightenment, and generally across the European Enlightenment, writing across what today we would call scientific disciplines or subjects was normal. Multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity was the norm. Why Smith's history of astronomy is important is not specifically as an historical review of how we came to understand the cosmos from classical antiquity to Sir Isaac Newton, but for how it outlines Smith's philosophy of science. In short, it provides an outline for what Smith thinks is the purpose of the scientific enterprise. And this is a first step for understanding how Smith thought and how he would approach a question or problem. For Smith, the success of a scientific theory is in its ability to, quote, soothe the imagination, end quote. The starting point for any inquiry is unfamiliar and unexpected phenomena, events, and objects which disturb the imagination. In Smith's words, what is new and singular excites that sentiment which, in strict propriety, is called wonder. What is unexpected, surprise, end quote. Neither of these feelings, these sentiments, wonder and surprise, are positive. These emotions are unpleasant. The goal of science is to provide explanations for novel and uncommon phenomena, which soothe the imagination and return us to a tranquil state. The scientific enterprise is thus driven by a psychological process. Wonder and surprise trouble the imagination, which drives curiosity. An explanation, that is a scientific theory, provides tranquility to the imagination, leading to a positive sentiment of admiration, that is, what is great or beautiful. The way that the imagination is soothed is through familiarity and simplicity, as the mind takes pleasure in the resemblances between different objects. A classification of an object or phenomenon is of little use without reference to something else. In our minds, we have the predisposition to expect certain familiar sequences of events, relying on our common sense to relate the familiar with the unfamiliar. When this process fails to soothe the imagination, we seek a scientific explanation. Smith may not have been able to foreshadow how challenging relating the familiar would become with the advancement of science in today's world. But the general tenor of his argument still holds. And that is what popular science writers today do. Scientific explanation is derived for Smith through inductive observation. We build the story from the ground up, from the real, not from the top down. Through the accumulation of many observations, we can generalize. But the scientist or philosopher is not content with simple induction. Common sense generalizations require connecting principles. This requires moving from the placement of one event in a sequence to the comparison of sequences of events themselves. Here, science goes beyond observable events to the provision of hypothetical models from which a wide variety of observable events can be deduced. An effect in science is a necessary creative and imaginative element, but this is not sufficient. The superiority of one theory over another is in how well a theory fits or can predict and be confirmed by observable events. Smith, like others in the Scottish Enlightenment, particularly David Hume, were greatly influenced by the advances in natural philosophy, how they referred to science, then made by Newton in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, which served as the basis for the Scottish Enlightenment's science of man, which contributed greatly to contemporary social science. In some ways, Smith's history of astronomy is an ode to the superiority of Newtonian science in comparison to its predecessors. Newton's theory of motion, for example, was able to explain the movement of celestial bodies through the principle of gravity. For Smith, gravity is a familiar and simple fact, the quote, reality of which we have daily experience, end quote. Indeed, history has it that Newton came up with the idea when he observed an apple fall from a tree in his garden. This image is something that is highly relatable to even the least initiated. You may recall from your days in primary school learning about gravitation with a picture of a tree and an apple falling. At least that was my experience in primary school. But this appeals to our common sense, which is a hallmark of much of Smith's writing. Newton's theory was furthermore superior, according to Smith, in its comprehensiveness. Newton was able to predict the trajectories of celestial bodies, which astronomers even then were able to verify empirically. Yet, praise for Newton should not lead one to believe that Smith was some kind of determinist or strict positivist. The history of astronomy is not a guide for how to conduct social science, where social and behavioral actions can be modeled with the same precision as the physical world. Smith allows for creative speculation, such as his metaphorical use of the invisible hand or the impartial spectator, allowing for intermediate explanations for what we may not be able to observe, though we can imagine them, but which ultimately must speak to and speak from a reality we can observe or have observed. In short, Smith is a realist. What Smith is concerned with in the history of astronomy is explaining why science is explanatory, which is a psychological question. Again, the aim of science is to soothe the imagination. But how this psychological state comes to be, that is, why scientific curiosity manifests, is not reducible to some innate and natural inclination in the human mind. The scientific endeavor is a social phenomenon. In other words, Smith appends a sociological theory to his psychological theory of science. Smith's effort in the history of astronomy is, quote, to trace it, that is, natural philosophy, from its first origin up to that summit of perfection to which it at present is supposed to have arrived, and to which, indeed, it has equally been supposed to have arrived in almost all former times, end quote. Now, what this statement suggests is that Smith's admiration for Newton, for having soothed the imagination, is not static. Newton ushered in a revolution in science, but Smith did not take it for granted that Newton's contribution could not be dethroned or built upon, as has happened historically with science. Notwithstanding his reverence for Newton, Smith did not foreclose the possibility that someone like Albert Einstein would come along 2 centuries later to again revolutionize our understanding of gravity and the cosmos. And we have moved on from Einstein's theories since, as Professor Hendry, I'm sure, can attest to. In short, Smith was cautious in how he thought about the development of knowledge. Smith's thinking is dynamic. But recall that Smith offers a sociological theory of science, concerned with tracing how science emerged and what social conditions are necessary for scientific progress. And here we can already see Smith's underlying aims with writing The Wealth of Nations, the full title of which is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Scientific endeavor emerges, to quote Smith, when law has established order and security, and subsistence ceases to be precarious. The curiosity of mankind is increased, and their fears are diminished. The leisure which they enjoy renders them more attentive to the appearances of nature, more observant of her smallest irregularities, and more desirous to know what is the chain which links them together, end quote. Hence, for Smith, science is made possible through the emergence of the rule of law and of commercial society, where increasing specialization removes subsistence conditions and provides for greater leisure time, at least for some. This was present first in Greece and the Greek colonies, in Sicily, Italy, and Asia Minor. However, this institutional environment was interrupted after the collapse of the Roman Empire until the Renaissance started to provide the conditions again for the flourishing of scientific endeavor in Europe. This does not mean that knowledge production was completely interrupted or that knowledge creation and scientific innovation elsewhere did not happen. Now, at this point, we can say that to think like Smith is to assemble the facts across time and space, to understand and interpret what really happens or has happened. But as history and our world is necessarily complex, our explanations require abstractions or creative devices to render them simple and comprehensible to others. But this rendering of Smith's thinking is not complete. In fact, it is too simple. There is more at stake. We must ask, what are Smith's values? What are his politics? What is the objective of his objectivity? Now, earlier I mentioned that Smith and Marx were different thinkers, and I'd like to return to that difference. In 1845, Karl Marx penned a set of 11 short philosophical notes, the Theses on Feuerbach, that would later inform the German ideology, which he wrote with Friedrich Engels, his co-author of the more famous and influential Communist Manifesto. The 11th thesis, which appears on his gravestone in Highgate Cemetery in London, is the most well-known. Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This powerful statement has become a rallying cry for radical intellectuals and remains a powerful statement for many scholars, and particularly self-declared scholar activists to this day. Now, Adam Smith would probably read Marx's statement with some, maybe a lot, of skepticism, and likely retort that the capacity of the philosopher to change the world, at least in profound ways, is wishful thinking and verging on utopian hubris. He would likely say that this is not how the world works, weary of the aims of revolution and the grand plans of any statesman or intellectual. This does not mean that Smith would be flippant with regards to the social conditions of the working classes that motivated Marx and others to want to change the world, and still do. Smith showed deep concern for the plight of the poor and the working classes in his pre-capitalist world, and he worried deeply about the human condition. But was Smith out to change the world like Marx? The answer to that question would likely be no. Smith and his fellow travelers of the Scottish Enlightenment came of an age on the back of Newton's triumph in science. They set forth to develop a new science of man inspired by Newton's scientific method and his empiricism. Smith's approach and that of his contemporaries is inductive, not deductive. Smith worked from the facts and appealed to our common sense. He theorized across patterns of observable fact based on available information to derive general laws of social development and human interaction. Like an apple falling from a tree, Smith uses the pen factory, the image of a pen factory, to explain how the division of labor operates. And that would have been, at the time, even relatable to his 18th century audience. Just as I have done in lectures to undergraduates, had them disassemble their iPhone to see where the parts come from to explain globalization. Or you can ask students where their breakfast come from and has them think about the world and how it is structured. Now, as eminent Smith scholar Samuel Fleischacker puts it, quote, to vindicate, and why Smith wanted to use these devices was to, quote, vindicate people's judgments with the supposedly better systems invented by intellectuals, end quote. If the point is not to change it, then what role does the philosopher have to play? Smith's work shows how progress has been won, if unexpectedly, but also how it is lost. Smith's work shows a certain fragility to social and economic development. There's no reason to suspect that progress cannot be reversed. Local circumstances and unexpected events historically have contributed to social cohesion and political development, such as the emergence of republican democracy in ancient Greece and Rome. Yet examples of social breakdown and stagnation in the historical record are plenty. Expounding wisdom of some kind on what path to take would be a delicate operation, one that Smith would likely abjure. The role of a philosopher in such a world, as the late economic historian Donald Witch argued of Smith's politics, was, quote, to preserve a cool head, to observe human conduct, and assign the proper causes and consequences, which meant that manners and customs had to be related to psychological propensities and circumstances, social institutions to historical location, end quote. In other words, we can see Smith as a cool, calm, and collected thinker. This is not an argument, however, for a dispassionate philosopher removed from society and providing reasoned observation from above. Smith and his peers were deeply aware of their own place in society and the weight of their arguments. They wrote from history, but for their present, a Scotland that had only recently emerged from feudalism and where a commercial society increasingly free of superstition and religious dogma was emerging. Smith was a realist, working from the facts to render an imminent critique of society. Smith was hence cautious and careful in his thought. But as Donald Winch goes further to highlight of Smith's politics, quote, "It was always necessary to defend such fundamental and instrumental values as liberty, humanity, tolerance, and moderation in order to protect the benefits of civilized society from such characteristic disorders as faction, enthusiasm, and superstition," end quote. Many have seen Smith as a defender of commercial society, and by extension, what today we call capitalism. And here I agree with political theorist Paul Sagar, who argues in an excellent recent book called Adam Smith Reconsidered, that Smith recognized simply that advanced civilizations were commercial societies. Assuming that no one wants to return to a pre-commercial society with greater indigence and violent forms of domination, then living in a commercial society is the only option. To quote Sagar, Smith's attitude towards commercial society is best thought of as akin to how a fish might think about water. To the fish, offering a defense of water is ultimately beside the point. Some version of this thing has to be lived in one way or another, end quote. And taking Smith this way is crucial, as it removes Smith as a putative defender of commercial society to one where the question that can be asked is what kind of commercial society, or capitalism for that matter, we want to try and live in. For Smith, the emergence of modern liberty in Europe after feudalism and the breaking of the power of the great lords was a major turning point and one not at all expected. Again, turning to Sagar's reframing of Smith as a political thinker, quote, "Modern liberty was, in the properly global perspective of pervasive political domination that Smith urged his audience to recognize, a major historical achievement, to be celebrated precisely because its benefits extended to unprecedented numbers of ordinary people," end quote. The rule of law and the separation of powers provided for the regular and impartial administration of justice. There was a degree of predictability and equal standing in the affairs of ordinary life. Smith put freedom in an historical frame. For much of human political history, domination reigned. It was the default norm. Contemporary observers would be right in pointing out that the extension of liberty in Smith's time was still very limited. And here I will contradict myself and say that I have no doubt that Smith would not dispute this. But major progress had been made that cannot be discounted, and progress has been made since. And to be sure, there is still much progress to be made. Rather than taking Smith as a prophet of liberalism in the modern sense of the term, Smith can be taken, as Sagar argues, as a theorist of non-domination. Smith was concerned with showing how power and domination operated, what its origins were, and what conditions were necessary for its removal. Few institutions survived Smith's onslaught. Just as Smith was critical of power and domination exercised by the state or the church, he was likewise critical of slavery, the merchant class, and what today we would see as a multinational or state capitalist enterprise, the East India Company. If we can simplify how to think like Adam Smith, if that's even possible for such a great thinker, the key takeaway is as follows. Adam Smith thinks principally from the real, not the ideal. What has happened and why? Who holds the power and why? What does this mean for individual liberty and the prosperity of society generally? This does not mean we cannot imagine a different world, but it does mean that Smith's thinking has a degree of skepticism on the likelihood or even desirability of grand plans. History has shown that progress is won, but also lost. Now, my lecture this evening certainly has not done justice to the scope and depth of Adam Smith's work, let alone the countless scholars and thinkers who have interpreted his work. There is more than one way to approach Smith. But As I mentioned in the beginning of my lecture, diverse viewpoints and reasoned debate are what makes an open society worth defending. For me, Smith is an invitation. Smith is an invitation to debate where our world has come and where it may be going. On that note, I would like to invite you to join me in that dialogue with Martin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam, for a fascinating and thought-provoking lecture. And I was especially pleased to hear the extended references to Adam Smith's History of Astronomy. It's an essay that I read myself some years ago. I revisited it in anticipating this event this evening. And I would echo all that you said about the approach that it represents, that it exemplifies in the way that Smith thought about science. I was especially struck by your own reference to how Einstein came along and built upon the work of Newton. And I think there's also, in my experience, a little too unhealthy a fascination with asking what Einstein would think rather than the more pertinent question, which is how Einstein would think. So that's another common thread between those two figures. So we're going to open to general questions in a little while, but first of all, we've got some contemporary topics that we're going to explore together that may offer the audience some stimulation for their own questions.
But first, do aliens exist?
Well, let's get that one out
of the way.
Absolutely. Well, again, you noted that Smith would work from the real rather than the ideal, and I think
I have a point to this, right?
An area that was developing around that same time was a deeper understanding of the notion of probability, and through the work of people like Reverend Thomas Bayes and Laplace and others. So I think, again, we haven't met them yet, or at least I don't think so. People say stuff about Falkirk and, places around there being the UFO capital of the UK. But I think, nonetheless, it's such a big universe with so many planets, discoveries that were becoming, clear, well, not the planets part, but the stars at least, to Smith, that I think he, like me, would take the view, as Carl Sagan put it, that if it is just us, then it's an awful waste of space.
Yes. That's a good way of putting it.
Well, I have to give the credit to Carl Sagan, but nonetheless, it's, I think, an apt description. And it's very exciting to live in a generation when possibly we could make that discovery. Again, it's great to hear that that's something that interests you as well. So, in terms of other, maybe somewhat more sobering contemporary topics than is there life in the universe, the first one I wanted to explore with you is the whole issues around state intervention. But this is something where we're seeing significant growth in state intervention across the world, including in supposedly liberal political economies. So how should we think about that through the lens of Adam Smith?
Right, so I mean, firstly to say that, again, the image of Smith I've tried to portray in that of the Scottish Enlightenment generally is one of open and critical dialogue and debate, and saying that we shouldn't be too prescriptive. And anything I say shouldn't be treated as sacrosanct or exhaustive or the final word. I think it's having that level of humility, which when I read Smith and read about his life and the period, is that there was a level of humility that I think we need for discussing some of our grand challenges. But I think it's taking that sense of asking hard questions and looking what has happened and using the good methods of social science that we have and science to answer these questions is positive, while at the same time recognizing that there is still political values that are worth fighting for and worth discussing. So we can't be completely objective. But so what we wanted to do this evening is then talk about these particular kind of things, and here's where I would invite audience participation to offer insight and thoughts, though don't give too long of a lecture. But as you mentioned, in terms of state intervention, and why I chose this as a topic is in part because that reflects a lot of the kind of research that I do generally as a social scientist, but also in part because I think for any of you that are looking at the world today, not simply here in Britain, but over the last 20 years, and what we see is a return of the state. And that's not to say that the state has left, but the period of what we would call neoliberal globalization has shifted. We see the rise of China, which some call as a state capitalist economy. But again, if we look at what's happening in Europe, and particularly in the United States, the kind of liberal paragon, look at how significant government spending is. And partly this is offered as a means of addressing climate change. So we look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, or the European Green Deal, or debates in the UK about, how do we kind of compete with these really large economic blocs, Europe, China, and the United States. But in short, we see all over the world the rise of, or a much more activist state. And I think for those that think of Smith as a classical liberal, and I think there's a lot to be said about and truth in that, is that the state being back is confronting, right? So I think it causes a lot of consternation for those, particularly those that I think would describe themselves as libertarian, of seeing that there's even more state. And I would like to ask a few questions about that, and in terms of, because when we think about the state and we think about the public-private divide, Smith isn't so specific, right? I mean, obviously he's generally in favor in his pre-capitalist, kind of pre-industrial time of freeing individuals to kind of make their own decisions. The kind of major, massive kind of industrial conglomerations that we have today didn't exist then. And arguably in Smith, there's, I think, a way of allowing for a particular state, even when he talks about his system of natural liberty, he talks about public works and what constitutes public works, right? So he's thinking about bridges and things like water, but he also includes things like public education, right? And when you think about the scope of that, and I think I've read some people say, yeah, but he's only talking about primary education. Anything after that, it's, should be for the private sector. But then they actually think, well, yeah, but we've advanced, and education has become massive, and you can't just simply go to primary school and expect to get a job. I mean, you have to have higher levels of learning, and so it forces us to ask these some really important questions, and that's why I say if we just go with what Smith said, he might have a different take on things today. Now, one interesting thing about kind of thinking about this public-private divide is not being so specific, is we think of, privatization is great, except when you privatize water in England and it turns out to be a disaster and the outcomes aren't actually good. And so you can imagine contexts where it's not so simple to kind of take this line of the state should stay back. However, the problem of over-enthusiastic, I think, expectations, this sort of man of system he talks about, and the concentration of power, I think, would have Smith, if we look at him as being kind of cautious on, when you see the rise of the state now in terms of going after these big problems as being necessary, and I think those on the left get excited about it, and those on the right get, though these days you look across right and left, and they all want bigger state, which I think is interesting.
And you mentioned, for example, multinational conglomerates didn't really exist, but there was the East India Company, for example. So, what was Smith's perspective on that? Yeah.
So, what's really interesting about Smith in some of his writings of the East India Company, so he was really critical of it. One thing because I do a lot of thinking on state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds, and I've written a lot about those, and I interact with actual existing ones today. And what's interesting is that his critique of the East India Company is not so much as it being this kind of state-owned, if you like, operation. What he was critical of is that it took on sovereign powers. So it was a company that then went to India and then became the sovereign, and in the process, any of its commercial aptitude was lost because it confused its what it was doing. And so, in my interpretation of this for the 21st century, I think to myself, well, and I think about this in terms of actually analyzing actually existing state-owned enterprises and state-owned institutional investors, is that many of them are being set up as, in the guise of operating like private sector actors and competing like private sector actors. in a way that they're trying to shed as much of their sovereign kind of attachment. They might be owned by a government, but they're actually operating and trying to compete in global markets just as a private company. And I wonder, well, what would Smith think about that and how he would think about that? And, it's not so simple to say that. And I think, so that's where we have to be careful in kind of having a prescriptive view of Smith. And it's more about when we think about the concentration of power, right? So what he would be concerned about is a very large, state company that purports to be private and competing on private markets, crowding out competition and making and disrupting markets.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot more to unpack there, but perhaps in the interest of time, because again, we can dig into that with the audience in a few minutes, but the second of our big themes that we want to explore with you, I guess, is climate change. So, I hope that there's little doubt now that we must address that as a matter of both mitigation and adaptation. But the challenge is that our global economy has been fueled by hydrocarbons for so long that's not easy to accomplish. So, what perspectives does thinking like Adam Smith bring to that highly challenging question, even if the details were, far in the future from Smith's perspective?
So I think what is valuable in Smith is that, again, thinking of him as not being prescriptive, is he allows for experimentation, and that's why he likes markets, right? Because it allows for this kind of diversity of action. And as you mentioned, there's few doubt that we need to do something about climate change. But again, our economy has been driven by hydrocarbons since from, the time that Smith was actually starting to write, and it's not so easily kind of unpacked. Yeah. So I think, an ode to when we think about, how we address climate change, it's on the one hand, it's an issue of technological innovation. But then there's also the bigger issues around, as I'll come to, on adaptation and mitigation in the places and the countries that it really matters, right? So I think what we don't know is what mitigation strategies and what technologies will necessarily work. I mean, we have a lot of experiments ongoing, but it isn't necessarily clear which ones will work and be and I don't think it will ever be one particular solution. And I think this shows that there's important kind of role for markets and experimentation. Now, the bigger question, though, is it goes back to the other point about how much state intervention is needed and where, and that's where you see a lot of, governments throwing a lot of subsidizing when they already over-subsidize hydrocarbons too much. But I think it's, how there's even when you see a lot of projects that are now, it's like the U.S. government's funding a lot of things. Now with interest rates going up, a lot of those projects are even not kind of interesting. And so I think it's the way Smith would approach that is how can we allow for further experimentation? I think that's what we're actually doing, right? So I mean, you think there's quite a bit of things happening. But I think the bigger challenge is the real transformation, and as much as we would like to go to net zero here in the UK or other advanced economies, our emissions are so little currently. I mean, past emissions, it's another story, but they're so low that we can go to net zero, but that's not going to change the climate. What really matters is will India go net zero? Will Sub-Saharan go after? And those are countries that want cheap, reliable energy. Yeah. And so the question is that, and they want it for their own development. And this is where I think the question for Smith would be, and this is a question for us, I think this is the question that's going to happen at COP28, is that you compare and contrast Glasgow 26 and then COP28 in UAE, and I think there's a different, it's interesting to see, and sorry if I'm going off on a tangent, I tend to do that, but it's interesting to see how Glasgow is held up quite high, and then because UAE is hosting it and it's a hydrocarbon-rich country, it's almost being boycotted by some people because it's not taken as legitimate. Yet it's that part of the world, and it's the developing world that looks at this as saying, well, wait a minute, it's great for you in the north to advance climate change mitigation, but we're the ones that are going to have to suffer and adapt, and how are you going to facilitate that? And I think what Smith would want to see is, how can we make markets work better to get the innovations out there and get those diffused? But I think he would also, be concerned with some of the grand pronouncements that you have from governments that come around that we're going to tackle this, and he would show some skepticism. Not saying that we shouldn't do that, but he would approach it that way.
Yeah, that seems consistent with what you were saying again about coming at things from a position of reality rather than idealism. Okay, so to again just set the scene for the broader discussion that will follow in a few minutes, our third theme to throw into the mixer is technology and AI. So, that's not one where we can look to Adam Smith for insights on the technological impact. But what about insights on some of the broader socio-political issues that we're now confronting in that sphere?
Right. So, I mean, the thing I think with AI and technology in general is 2 points. One is that I think we often, when you think about the transformational potential, is that we often overestimate, but then at the same time underestimate the disruption. Partly because we don't know what will be disruptive. So we take AI for example, and we see enough progress to think, okay, it's going to be disruptive. But the jury's still out. Well, how disruptive will it be to the labor market? I mean, we've seen that across the last 200 plus years that through technological change, it disrupts, and there will be people that lose out and on work and stuff. But then we seem to be able to move to a situation where people in one, when the technology's moved on so there's always that labor market issue. And I think, going to Keynes, I'm still waiting for the what Keynes wrote about where, we work a 20-hour a week, and we're still trying to get there. And every time we have all these new kind of technologies, we don't seem to be getting more. It just seems to be changing things. And I think the bigger questions which Smith would be interested in around artificial intelligence, which again, and I'm not offering something that's necessarily super unique, but I think he would be asking the questions that we're asking about this, who controls these algorithms, who controls our data, who controls the use of these, and how is that governed, right? And is it a public and private? And we saw just a couple of weeks ago with OpenAI, the kind of really interesting company almost blew up because there was the big fight between the nonprofit board, but then at the same time, the nonprofit board didn't want the CEO to push further because they were worried about the advancement. But I think it probably mainly came down to the struggles of the nonprofit, sort of more idealistic, to the issues of, well, AI requires a lot of computing power, and that requires a lot of money and a lot of chips and a lot of investment. And this is where the kind of profit
a lot of energy
and a lot of energy, right? And so this is where the kind of ideal of, but then you come into that situation of how it's governed, and you see that being played out in a private corporation, as well as in the broader, debates that we're having, which was a few weeks ago, the AI summit here in Britain about, who controls these things, and I think those are the questions that Adam Smith would ask, right? Is how do we balance between fostering and creating innovation versus kind of like constraining it. And I think that's always the thing is if we overregulate something, then we kill it before it's provides us the emancipatory kind of potential with it. I think he would also be concerned with the surveillance society aspect, issues around privacy, and how in particular illiberal governments, though it seems to happen even in liberal governments, kind of the overuse of data for nefarious purposes or invading our privacy. And I think, but the other question, and this kind of gets to a theory of moral sentiments kind of perspective of Smith, is that he would likely be concerned, as I think we all are and have been for the last, since particularly smartphones came around, is about what does it mean, and social media is the erosion of real life interactions and human creativity. I mean, trying to think about what ChatGPT means for teaching and students.
I think about it every day.
And
yes.
it's really quite sad because, you think, we have to worry about that because students are not motivated to write and do things. And just the sense of, I mean, this is why it's so great to have a room full of people to speak to and see in real life. It's great, though, that we have people that are able to join in and listen. I think that's also useful. So I think it's, understanding the erosion of our kind of human condition, in particular, in young people. So these kind of questions that we ask, and that's how he would wonder how it's regulated. Yeah.
I was in a discussion recently about the impact of generative AI on learning, teaching, and assessment, and I was expecting my colleague to say something like, it makes you wonder what the value of. I was expecting them to finish, a degree would be. They said it makes you wonder what the value of being human is.
Yeah.
Which was taking it one step further, but I suppose that's the trajectory we're on. Anyway, hopefully that's given you a good flavour of a range of topics that we would encourage you to now join in with, or indeed other questions or comments that you have. So I open it to the floor, and we've also got the opportunity to hear questions from our online guests as well. So over here. We've got roving microphones, so if you wait till the microphone arrives, that way our guests online will hear you loud and clear as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Chris Gower, Edinburgh University Business School. In terms of discombobulating experiences, I would have thought Adam Smith would find it wildly exciting the extent to which the model of the market that he had has gone kind of global, and that almost retreat from feudalism can't be taken for granted. I mean, certainly China, the change there from authoritarianism and so on, America following suit. And the division of labour has gone global. But the thing that perhaps he wouldn't have anticipated and that would have shocked him is the extent of global concentration. There are now very few, 80% of sectors are not fragmented. Yeah. They're not national. They are global. They are what in my book it would be called global oligopolies. His pin industry, by 1980, there's only 4 major global players. So surely going back to the East India Company, that is the thing that he'd have loved to see updated and debated and so on.
Right. So I mean, I guess the question is are markets functioning as they should in the Smithian sense of, he thinks of the concentration, right? So his idea was, and this I think is what's important about, but that is exactly the point of not trying to actualize Smith from the 18th century to this day, because when he was thinking about the pen factory, when he was thinking about market interactions, it was actually much smaller scale. And he talks about the brewer and the butcher and the baker, and these are kind of small businesses, and now we have these massive, global, highly concentrated, increasingly some of those are state-owned concentrated kind of forms of capital, and that, you're right, have an effect of how much market competition is there, right? And how much of this thing, and this I think he would be potentially disturbed by. But at the same time, I don't want to, again, actualize his thought and say that he would think, oh, this goes against the model that I have, because, again, we have benefited massively from the extension of the division of labor in terms of, maybe it's not good for us, but we're able to have much more stuff, right? And it's not a case for kind of consumer kind of society, but at the same time, it is reflective of, we're able to create more from less. And those large corporations and large kind of conglomerates have come together for a particular reason. I think the bigger issue is who's creaming off the profits, right? But the actual productive aspects, is one I think is not necessarily to say that markets aren't working.
Other questions? Yeah, we've got one there. And then in
Hi.
front.
Thank you for your lecture, and I'm glad to be part of this discussion. I guess I have 2 questions, kind of a 2-parted question. So the first part being, in our present age with so much critique around the capitalist model, do you think that it is actually possible for a society, whether that be as individuals or collective, nation, and beyond, do you think that it's possible for us to continue to evolve without a capitalistic incentivization whether that be through technology, through medicine, through business, through education. And also, the second part being, I guess, discussion around how capitalism has actually lifted people out of poverty globally by creating extra resources. Yet it's thought that if we all had our needs met and we lived in the Roman garden and we had a universal basic income, we would continue to innovate and to cut edge of science and write poetry and whatnot. But actually you need a bit of suffering to push yourself into a situation that has that deprivation, which is where you actually create resources. So I'm just wondering how that all plays into the hand of this conversation and how we continue to move forward and develop if we actually have our needs met. Would that actually sink us? And the second part being that, is there a way to function as a society without capitalism? Or is that actually impossible? Would we just revert into the cave?
No. Fascinating question. I mean, so I think, so I'm not a Hegelian like Marx was, so I don't expect that, we're going to kind of come to a fifth stage. And I mean, I'd like thinking about, how capitalism, evolves. I'm very skeptical that it will collapse, though it could. Again, this is going to be speculative, and this is where I think, Smith would not speculate that, the Roman Empire lasted for 1,000 years or something like that. So it's not that what we have now is, I mean, I think some people always think it will be collapsed, but I think to say, and this is what Marx or Smith would likely say if he were able to kind of observe what has happened, is he would say that look how dynamic capitalism is and how much it's the most dynamic. And this was even Karl Marx was able to recognize that capitalism was a very dynamic and innovative system. And I think the question goes to is that if you take those kind of, as you mentioned, I think some of the scarce resources and some of the drive that will, it's like if you get a trust fund, what do? You kind of waste it. And, and I think you have to have that particular drive. And in as much as I'd like to think about there's an ideal form after that's kind of less harmful socially and ecologically, I'm skeptical that will come about. And I think when you look at the experience of China, which the CCP, you can say it's the Communist Party of China, but at the same time, it's lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, partly because it's capitalist, and it's become part of a capitalist world system. And yeah, that capitalist world system has limits, but I don't suspect that it's going to collapse anytime soon. And I think Smith's attitude, or how he would approach it, he would probably say, I mean, if you looked at the 20th century, they'd say, well, they tried something different. Though some people would say that the Soviet Union was state capitalist and it wasn't actual existing socialism, but that's another debate. But he would say, well, what has the historical record shown? And really, capitalism has been persistent and it's unlikely to collapse anytime soon.
We had a question in front, but just before we come into that, I just wanted to note that I was struck by the comments in your lecture about the emergence of scientific thinking in societies that have reached the point where they're no longer essentially worrying about where the next meal is coming from. And that, I think, is interesting, taken with your fascinating question, that if you go too far, maybe that we lose the drive for innovation, for scientific inquiry, if our lives become too easy.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a question of things being too easy, because you need that ease to, we need to not be worrying about subsistence and precarity. And this is where I think when we look at Smith and when he was concerned about the division of labor and he was worried about the monotony of it, and he was worried, that's why he was a proponent of public education, because he was worried about those that would just sit and work in a factory all day. Yeah. And that's why he wanted public works, and there's kind of, he wanted this flourishing of culture and other thing to kind of promote, he saw the downsides of of further specialization. And this, I think, for us in a liberal, open society, we can't just sit there and think that the market's going to, the market provides, but at the same time, to allow that agency, we need to make sure that those worse off
Yes.
can still participate, because we want them to, you don't know who the next Einstein is going to be.
Very true.
This is why we don't want to have a closed society. We want to be able to create the opportunities for people to flourish. Sometimes creating the opportunities for flourishing is about, allowing markets to do their thing. Yeah. But sometimes it's also about creating those conditions for science and inquiry and free time for people to think. Yeah. I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you. So let's go to that question in front.
Hi. So I was wondering, I thought it was interesting, this question about increased state intervention and how you said both the left and the right today seem to want more state intervention. And it got me thinking, why is that? And what aspects of society today make people want more interventions? And just thinking about what you said about the decreasing social interactions between people today with technology, I wonder, is there some kind of a lack of trust between fellow citizens, and people would have less trust in private enterprise or for private companies to do things for good and not just for profit? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Okay. Technology at work. So the answer to the first question, I think, is it depends on where and how. So I think when I say the right and the left, you look at, take the United States, for example. The Republican Party likes to think, they're the budget responsible ones, yet they increase spending. They vote for all the kind of massive spending increases, and they have done for decades. You look across Europe, those parties that are considered populist, you look at their programs, and they're quite heavy on kind of state intervention and kind of social programs. So that's why I say that it's not simply a easy kind of left-right split. But what we mean by state intervention generally, part of things they're driven by, in the global context, the rise of China as well. So European governments, I think, across and North America as well, they're responding to China's state capitalism by becoming their own kind of state capitalist. I think that's one point to point out. The second question on trust, this is where, if we want to think like Smith, he didn't necessarily have a preference for public or private. So in as much as we like to think of Smith as this critic of big government, that's true, but at the same time, he wasn't necessarily, that doesn't mean that he necessarily would have trusted a private authority as well. And I think that's an important point to take from Smith, is that he was kind of, wouldn't necessarily put his trust in the state more than a private company. And I think that's the way, it's good that we should trust in a democracy our governments. It's bad if we don't. But I think, that doesn't mean as active citizens we should just kind of sit back, right? So I think it's the more about the active citizen aspect of it that would be important for Smith.
Thank you. And I think Hannah has a question from online. Are you going to read it for us, Hannah?
Yes, I am indeed. Yes, we've got a question from Anne online who says, if Adam Smith's basic principles is to first assemble the facts, how should we deal with a world where facts are disputed?
Great question.
Fantastic question. So I think so I would say that the way, it's by, so one thing is like we should assemble more facts. I think Smith would say that we can be objective in some facts and we can debate the other ones, but I think it's that idea of an open society where we foster debate, that we kind of can work towards we know what are the facts and what aren't the facts, right? So I think it's not sort of putting people in camp saying these are the facts, and it's through that dispute, and that's why we should have more debate and more open, whereas people I think are afraid to debate things, or but I think if we find through debate and through conversation we could come to agreement on what the facts are, and I think disagreement is fine, right? I think that's what we have to accept in an open society.
If I may, just wearing my kind of RSC hat, to some extent, we both are tonight, but particularly, looking at the slogan, knowledge made useful, and looking at the legacy that the Royal Society of Edinburgh has, for me, what's really critical is it being properly informed debate, but that's hard to shape in the modern world because there is so much misinformation out there. So last week, I was at an event called Science in the Parliament over in Dynamic Earth, close to Holyrood. And, I think what we sought to discuss and debate in a healthy way with our elected representatives was the value of education more broadly, but particularly in science. And I put forward the view that perhaps the most important thing that we can convey through education in the 21st century is that ability to tell the difference between the information and the misinformation. And that, for me, although you've used as an appropriate code word, facts. Actually, facts are always going to be subject to one's assumptions. But equipping people with the tools to be able to make those judgments for themselves is critical.
I think just to follow on, there's what I find kind of somewhat concerning is you mentioned that there's so much in misinformation, and I think there's a risk of governments and regulators to wanting to censor what they think is misinformation. Because I think a lot of these efforts to censor misinformation, you start peeling it apart, and you think, well, they've made this assumption that's misinformation because of these particular assumptions. And I think that's where I think the question is more important. That's where Smith, I think, would be more interested in is what is the reaction to disputes on the facts. And I think if, and this takes us into the question of censorship, which I think he would be very skeptical of as actually working, right? So the way you fight misinformation is not by, saying it's more information, it's by providing more facts and providing more space. But it's also about, educating citizens. And I think it's also about allowing for people to disagree on different points.
In order not to illustrate that point, I firmly agree with that.
Yes.
But I respect the position of potential disagreement. Are there any more questions from the room or indeed from online? Yep, we've got one at the back.
I just want to say, what do you think are some of the limitations of Smith's thinking in today's world? Where do you think, to what extent can we apply Smith's thinking? Is it to the extent of thinking about AI that we find some limitations within Smith's thinking, or within terms of generative AI for technological advancement? Because I think you mentioned before that Smith's time is quite limited in the sense that it was pre-capitalist and pre-democratic, and how do you reconcile that essentially?
So I think the point about him being in a different period, there's still a lot in Smith that we can use to inform us on contemporary issues, right? So again, I think going back to the point of his time was different, but he was still interested in, who controlled things, what was the power, right? And I think that's so many of the questions that we debate with today is, well, who's controlling this, and who's deciding how a particular course of action. So I think, things like AI, many of the governance issues are not necessarily new to what we've faced in terms of technological innovation in the past. And so that's why I think looking at Smith, and again, the point too is that, we're celebrating Smith here this evening, but there's so many other thinkers, and that's why the message I wanted to give about is that, we can look to Smith, but he's not the only thinker. And again, it's the bigger point is that it's our own agency, our own kind of capacity to think and ask these questions. Yeah, referring to, some of these past thinkers, but for guidance or for wisdom, but to also not just put them up as an icon. And that's where I think many, Smith might not be appropriate for every social, economic, or innovation problem that we have, but there's still a lot of insight that we can draw from him. But I think for me, it's the spirit of Smith, and more importantly, the spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment and what it kind of brought for the creation of the modern university and the modern world in ways that it forces to ask questions systematically and to research but to also be creative in thinking about the possibilities and being honest about what we know and what we don't know.
Well, sadly, our time is almost up,
Okay.
and that seems like a very positive note on which to end, as we acknowledge the contribution that Smith made to that Scottish Enlightenment and the legacy that it's created for all of our society, but specifically the Royal Society of Edinburgh.
Yes.
So we're delighted that you were able to join us to
Thank you
share
very much.
in this celebration of Smith's legacy. And I'd like to thank everyone in the room for joining us this evening, and also our guests online. So let's thank Adam again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin.